Hey guys, welcome back to my etching series. In the last two videos, I showed you how to apply a resist to a piece of sterling silver, and then I showed you how to etch that piece with ferric nitrate to get a great texture. In this video, we're going to concentrate on finishing up the piece. So I've made a mark around the edge of the design to make it more visible where I need to saw out the piece. I want to be sure and saw just outside of the design to give myself a bit of space to file back to the etched edge. As you are sawing, you want to be sitting at a comfortable height. The recommended height is to have your bench pin at about shoulder level, but I tend to sit slightly higher than that. Just play around and see what is most comfortable to you. You also don't want a death grip on your saw. You should have a fairly loose grip and let your saw do the work. Don't force it or you will be breaking lots of saw blades. It also helps to use a lubricant like Pepe Lube or beeswax to keep the blade from binding. So just keep at it until your piece is completely sawn out. I'll finish this off camera and then come back when we're ready to file. For the shaping work, we can use a variety of files to refine the piece. I generally start with a number 2 Swiss file, which takes away material fairly quickly, and then use a number 4 Swiss file, which is less aggressive. I use a ring file, which is flat on one side and rounded on the other to work around contoured shapes, which is what I'm using here, or a flat file for pieces that have straight sides. You may need to use needle files to get into tighter spaces, and there are a variety of shapes of files available. After shaping with the files, you can use varying grits of sandpaper to smooth out the file marks that you made. At this point, I like to use my jewel tool with the Scotch-Brite pad attachment to smooth out my file marks and to slightly round the edges to make it more comfortable to wear. I realize many of you may not have this tool, so you can do this with a variety of sanding sticks and sandpaper, progressing through different grits, and then finishing with 3M polishing papers to take out the marks left by the sandpaper. The general idea is to get rid of those rough file marks. And even using the jewel tool, there will be areas that I cannot get to, and I'll need to use sandpaper and polishing papers in those areas. If you're going to add a hallmark or a maker's mark, this is a good time to do that. Just place your piece on a bench block, position your stamp, and use a hammer to strike the stamp. It's generally recommended you use a brass hammer because brass is not as hard as the steel of the stamp and will not damage it or shatter it. I like to rock the stamp from side to side and up and down to get a full impression. If you hammer too hard, you may lose some of the texture on the other side of the piece and you'll see a little bump on the other side. I now need to start working on my bail. I'm going to use a half round sterling silver wire that's 6 gauge, and I've marked the piece to 1.5 inches, and I'll just use my saw to cut it to length. This wire is pretty thick, so I definitely need the saw to cut it. If it were a thinner wire, then you could get away with just using wire cutters. But in this case, the saw is definitely your friend. Before I try to start bending this piece of wire, to make it easier, I want to make sure it's dead soft. I just need to anneal it first. To make it easy, just place a mark with a Sharpie and heat until that mark goes away. I'm using my acetylene air torch, but you can use a handheld butane torch. Once the piece is annealed, you can just quench it in water and then pickle it for a few minutes. I've shared what I use for a pickling solution in previous videos, but the recipe that I use will be included in the description. Now that I have the piece cut and annealed, I'm using my wrap and tab pliers to try and coax that end over and shape it so that I can attach it to the rest of the pendant. Even though I nailed it, it is pretty thick wire and it's taking some force to get it where I want it. Now I'm just testing the fit against the rest of the pendant. And I see that I need to trim that back piece. So I'm marking it because I want to cut it parallel with the back of the pendant. Get my saw and set it up on my bench pen. I have a little notch there that should help, trying carefully not to cut into my fingers. It's such a small piece, it's really tricky to hold. Unfortunately, I actually did wind up nicking my finger a little bit there at the end, but that happens from time to time, especially when you're sawing. Now I just need to file down where I sawed that piece parallel, just to make it fit the piece better. And there's a lot of adjusting at this stage on this bale to make it fit just how I want it. Now that I have it fitting like I want, I'm marking the bottom of the bale. I want it to come down to the end of that tail, and I will saw that piece off, and then I'll start shaping it. Using my number 2 Swiss ring file, I'm now shaping the bottom of that bale to a point. I could have used my flat file just as easily as the ring file. So this will take me a while to file away the excess material to get it to just the right shape. Now that I have my bale shaped, I'll test the fit and see how it looks. I need to get rid of all of those rough file marks so the buffing sticks really come in handy for this job. So I'll just go over this and smooth out all those marks with my sanding sticks before I solder this onto the rest of the pendant. So here it is, ready to solder. I'll just take that bail off. There's a nice tight fit. And I will sand where I want the solder to flow, just to remove any oils that may have gotten onto the piece. So I'll do that for the front as well as for the back. I will also sand the back of the bale in preparation for the solder operation. There will be two solder operations on this. The first will be a sweat solder, and the second will be pick soldering. So I'll show you both methods. I'm just setting up the piece in my third hand to make it a little easier to keep it in place. And now I need to flux the piece. And you've seen in previous videos that I use Handy Flux, which is great for soldering. And just apply that where I want that solder to flow. For this, I'll be using Easy Solder since I won't be soldering anything else to it. No bezels or anything like that, so I can use Easy Solder. And it's wire solder that I have flattened so it doesn't roll off the piece. And I just clean it with a green Scotch-Brite pad to remove any debris that may be on it. Make sure that it's good and clean. I'm just cutting off a couple of snippets, and I like to use quite a bit of solder when I'm sweat soldering so that I know that I get a good strong hold. I just place those little snippets on the piece, and you can see I've only got two. That's all I need for this. Again, I'm using my acetylene air torch, but you can use a handheld butane torch. You just start to slowly heat the piece so that the flux doesn't bubble up and displace your solder. And a lot of times this will happen. So if it does, just pick it back up, put it back on, and continue. So I'll heat this up from the underside, and then I'll come on top and apply some heat. And basically you're just heating it until that solder melts. And you see that I'm using a solder pick here. I can use that solder pick to help me distribute the solder once it flows. After the piece stops glowing red, then you can quench it and then put it in your pickle pot to clean off all those oxides. Then we'll come back and solder it to the pendant. I have already applied a barrier flux, which I'll show you a little later how I do that. I've applied the regular flux and fitted the piece, and now I'm just going to heat this up so that that solder that I sweat soldered earlier can flow and attach the bale to the front of the piece. So we'll slowly heat this up, making sure we heat the whole piece, and then we'll start to come in and concentrate on that area around that bale. It is the thicker piece, so it'll take a bit of heat for that to start flowing, and you're just watching for a flash of silver around the edges around that bale. I'll be doing one last soldering operation, so I'm going to go ahead and quench and flux this piece, and we'll be right back. I mentioned earlier that I use a barrier flux, and a barrier flux is used to prevent fire stain and Firescale. All it is a mixture of denatured alcohol and boric acid. Just stir that up really well, and then I dip my piece in the solution and get it coated really well. And you can let it dry on its own. The denatured alcohol will evaporate away and leave a film of the boric acid, or you can just heat it and burn off that alcohol. And I like that green flame. I think it's pretty cool. So I tend to burn it off. But I know that they say that if you let it dry on its own, that it gives a better coating. I haven't had any problems with it. So now we need to solder the back side. And I did not sweat solder underneath. So what I'm going to do is what's called pick soldering. With pick soldering, you pick up the solder using your solder pick, and then you place it wherever you need to on your piece. So it gives you a bit more control. And I've already cut my piece of solder, and it's on the charcoal block. I didn't show it here, but you also need to use your handy flux as well and put that where you want the solder to flow. And then you heat up your piece a little bit to get it warm. And you notice I'm holding my pick in my right hand, and I heat that up and pick it up with the pick, and then I can place it wherever I need that solder to be. Sometimes it takes a little bit of practice to get that solder onto your piece. And then you just heat it up and let that solder flow. And if you need to, you can use that solder pick to coax that solder in, wherever you need it. So now my bale is soldered on, and the piece should be ready for finishing. But first, we quench it and then throw it in the pickle for a few minutes to remove any oxides and any remaining flux. Here's our soldered piece. Our bale looks good. We just want to take a few minutes to do a bit of finishing work using our sanding sticks. We want to get rid of any scratches. We want to get rid of any solder that flowed outside of the areas that we wanted it, and just clean it up a bit. From here, we'll take it to the ultrasonic cleaner and clean it up real good in preparation for applying a patina. To get the piece ready for the patina, I clean it in a heated ammonia solution. I'll include that recipe in the description. Just clean it really well with a soft brass brush. You'll want to get this from a jeweler's supply because the ones you get from your local hardware store are too stiff and will really scratch up your pieces. We're just trying to remove any debris left over from sanding or any oils that may have transferred from your fingers. Make sure it's really clean before we apply that patina. And once we're done cleaning the piece, we just need to rinse it really well and dry it off. Here's our cleaned piece, and I use Midas Black Max. I prefer this over the liver of sulfur if I want to get a dark gray color. And I apply this just using a cotton swab. And I find I don't really use that much with this application method. So I just apply it, getting it into all the crevices. And you'll see that it immediately starts turning the piece black. And you just want to take a little time getting it down into all of those etched areas. When we take the sanding stick and sand away across the top, it'll leave that in those depressed areas. You may need to put a couple of applications on, but usually the first application does a pretty good job. You want to make sure that once you're done applying the patina to your piece, that you close up that bottle really well and you immediately throw away that cotton swab. I made the mistake of leaving that out on my desk next to one of my steel tools, and the next morning when I came back out to the studio, that tool had rusted already. So it's some pretty powerful stuff, and you don't want to just leave it lying around, and you should never leave this stuff lying around any of your tools. And that goes with a lot of the chemicals in your studio. So you definitely want to protect those tools. You also want to work in a well-ventilated area. That doesn't only apply to adding the patina, but especially when you're soldering or applying patina or working with any chemicals, you definitely want ventilation in your studio. So if you need to open up a window and put a fan in front of it, that's a good idea. If you have a ventilation system, that's even better. If you need to wear a respirator, that'll work as well. Once you've finished applying the patina, it's very important that you neutralize it with a mix of water and baking soda. So I just have this container here that has a bit of baking soda in water, and I rinse it real well in that first. And then the other container that I have is just plain water, and then I just rinse that baking soda off with the plain water. We are finally on the home stretch, and it's time to remove that excess patina. I like to use my Flux shaft and silicone knife edge wheels. These are probably a really fine grit because they leave a bit of a polish to it, but it is very good at removing that patina on the highlighted areas. So you just run it against the raised areas, and you'll see that it starts to remove the patina, but it leaves it in the etched areas. The trick with these wheels is to hold it at an angle where it doesn't reach down into the etched areas. If it does, it'll remove patina in there as well. But you also don't want the top of that screw head to hit your metal because it will scratch it. So you just need to be careful, and you might want to practice on a different piece. If you don't have a flex shaft and silicone wheels, you can also do this with your sanding sticks, and if you have 3M polishing papers, put that on a rigid surface and use that as well. You just want to be careful not to remove the patina in the etched areas. Once I've removed all of the patina, then I like to polish the piece, and I'm just switching out my wheel to a little buffing wheel, and I like to use ZAM. It's a great polishing compound, and it can give you a pretty high shine. So I just get some of that on my buffing wheel, and then I just go over the piece and go over all parts of it. And you can see that it imparts a really nice shine. And you don't need to press like really hard or anything. You just go over it, and you may have to go over it several times. And your hands will get black, and the piece may even have black residue on it as well. And you'll have to clean that up in your ammonia solution after you're done. I'm really happy with how this piece turned out. I do like a lot of contrast in my pieces, so in addition to the patina, I like to add Gilder's paste wax. It comes in a little tin, and I just apply it with a cotton swab and let it set for a little bit, and then I will buff off the highlighted areas to remove the paste. It does leave a nice dark finish. I hope you enjoyed this series on etching. If you like this content and would like to see more, please subscribe, like, leave a comment, and hit that notification bell to receive notifications when I post new videos.